Last time we spoke about the First Encirclement Campaign against the CCP. The Jiangxi Soviet expanded despite opposition, but urban uprisings struggled, with labor union support declining. Li Lisem pushed for urban revolts, while Mao Zedong favored rural expansion. In 1930, failed attacks on Nanchang and Changsha deepened the divide between their strategies. Mao Zedong's forces later captured Jian, but tensions led to purges, including the Futian incident. Meanwhile, the Nationalist Army launched an encirclement campaign. Mao Zedong's strategy of luring the enemy in deep ultimately positioned the CCP for survival and future success. The NRA exploited internal conflict amongst the Reds, launching attacks on Donggu. Miscommunication led to friendly fire between NRA divisions. Despite capturing towns, overextension weakened the NRA, allowing the Red Army to counterattack. Through guerrilla tactics and local support, the Reds encircled and decimated multiple NRA divisions, capturing thousands of prisoners and weapons. Mao Zedong's strategies proved effective, bolstering Red Army morale and influence. By the end of the third campaign, the Jiangxi Soviet had expanded significantly. This episode is the Fourth Encirclement Campaign. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you will learn a bit more about the history of Asia. Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia, and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, found over at YouTube and all major podcast platforms. Over on the YouTube channel, I just released a full documentary covering the experience of Lieutenant Colonel Tom Williams and his time during the Vietnam War. It can also be found in the form of a podcast. Now, I want to ask a favor. I recently opened up a YouTube membership. It's identical to my Patreon account, found over at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. Joining either gets you access to the exclusive podcast, which is about 25 plus episodes and ongoing. You'll also get early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. But if you decide to join the YouTube membership, there's a bit of a bonus. I have a lot of unlisted content that has not been put up for years, for various reasons. A lot of politically incorrect reasons. For those of you who like a bit of comedy with your history, I think it might be up your alley. So please do check it out. Oh, and lastly, before we start the episode, I do have a bit of an announcement. For those of you who are fans of my personal podcast, the Pacific War Channel podcast, I'm actually going to be changing its name. You see, covering the Pacific War exclusively, while doing an entire podcast, which is the Pacific War Week by Week, for probably, I think it'll be 5 years by the time it's over, it seems a bit redundant. So me and my co-host came up with a new idea. We're going to do not exactly general history, but something geared towards military history. The title of the podcast will be Echoes of War, and we're going to be covering everything from ancient warfare, medieval warfare, modern warfare, and such. So I do invite all of you to stay tuned. It'll be coming out quite soon. The CCP had just survived 3 brutal encirclement campaigns in 1931, collectively known as the First Encirclement Campaign. The Reds were quite lucky in 1931, for China had major problems requiring Chiang Kai-shek's attention. Understandably, one of these major problems was a full-blown Japanese invasion of Manchuria. That, rest assured, we will tackle in depth in the future episodes. But for coherency's sake, I thought it best to try and get through all the other events before we start talking about the beginning of the 15-year war between Japan and China. The Japanese invasion immediately began influencing the KMT-CCP conflict. The Japanese invasion directly threatened Soviet interests, and Moscow looked at the CCP as a potential bulwark against the Japanese. From 1930 to 1931, the CCP's Red Army was successful in defending their territory against the NRA extermination campaigns. However, they still suffered from a lack of discipline, supplies, and professionalism. New leadership came from the new Central Committee, now led by the 28 Bolsheviks and a new Comintern representative, Otto Braun. The Red Army began adopting a series of initiatives in 1932 to improve. All Red Army units were standardized to establish better command and control. Political indoctrination and military training also became standardized with waves upon waves of manuals distributed to the forces. The Red Army expanded the Red Academy by establishing the Red Army War College for mid-grade and senior officers. There was an introduction of branch schools and specialty schools to increase competency and training. Political mobilization remained cornerstone to the Red Army. Recruitment of the new troops also began to see a renewed emphasis on urban proletariats. A large change to the operations for the Red Army was the adoption of Soviet offensive tactics to seek out decisive battles. CCP leaders were under the misbelief that revolutionary fever would simply have the Red Army victory. What they lacked initially was professionalism, alongside good weaponry and equipment. Couple this with the NRA's adoption of more and more effective counterinsurgency tactics, the Red Army really began to suffer terrible casualties. Now, I just want to note, the Red Army defeating the NRA in the Third Extermination Campaign of 1931 is not to be mistaken for the larger Third Extermination Campaign later. Another intra-party power struggle was brewing in the CCP as well. After the fall of Lilisan, a group of students returning from studies in the USSR began a systematic operation to gain control over the CCP. This group became known as the 28 Bolsheviks. 20 or so of them returned to China with the new Comintern advisor, Pavel Mif, in 1931. Two key members of the group, Qin Bangshan, known colloquially as Bao Ge, and Chen Xiaoyu, known as Wang Ming, would seize key positions at the top brass of the CCP. Many of these students attended Moscow's Sun Yat-sen University, where they became acquainted with Mif, the head rector of said university. This university was breeding ground for ultra-orthodox Stalinist communist doctrine. It goes without saying the students were indoctrinated with a very Moscow-like perspective. Mif regarded them as a very well-disciplined force, and he used them to purge out divergent groups within the university. During the Third Plenum in September of 1930, Mif attempted to use the forum to denounce Lilisan's plan, but had failed to convince the majority of the Central Committee. After Lilisan was condemned and recalled to Moscow, Mif saw a major opportunity. At the Fourth Plenum, in January of 1931, Lilisan and 11 of his supporters were ousted from the Central Committee, with their best positions seized by the Moscow-aligned CCP members. The next year, the 28 Bolsheviks unleashed a brutal intra-party war with other factions. By late September, the Bolsheviks effectively destroyed most of the opposition and incorporated the surviving members into a Central Committee loyal to Moscow. Bao Ge was appointed head of the Central Committee from Wang Ming, who returned to Moscow. Once the 28 Bolsheviks were in control of the CCP at Shanghai, they then set their eyes upon Mao Zedong and the Red Army Soviet areas. During the first All-China Soviet Congress of November of 1931, they launched their first attack. Mao Zedong received prior word of their intentions from loyal followers in Shanghai, and he prepared to face them. Before the Central Committee arrived at Wujin, Mao Zedong had just emerged victorious from the encirclement campaigns. He had suppressed dissension amongst his ranks and established a delegation of loyalists within the Soviet Congress. The Bolsheviks failed to gain a majority within the Congress, taking only 2 seats in the Central Executive Committee of the Soviet. Meanwhile, Zhu De was appointed Commissar of War, and other Mao Zedong loyalists took high-ranking positions. To try and break Mao Zedong's monopolistic control over the Red Army, the Bolsheviks employed Zhou Enlai. In early 1932, the CCP urged the Red Army to expand Soviet territory as its forces grew. Successful defenses against encirclement campaigns brought many NRA soldiers into the Red Army, some willingly, others by force. A key boost came on December the 14th of 1931, when the NRA's 26th Red Army rebelled and joined, forming the 5th Red Army Corps. With this and other recruits, the First Front Red Army grew to about 70,000, requiring more territory to sustain itself and the revolution. On January the 9th of 1932, the CCP Central Committee issued a resolution outlining a new strategy for the party and for the Red Army. The resolution assessed the current situation in China, that of a major depression, the effects of the Mukden incident, and a string of CCP successes against the encirclement campaigns. The resolution reasserted the renewed commitment to recruit urban proletariats for the revolution and to, quote, expand the territory, link up the separated Soviet areas to form an integrated Soviet area, and take advantage of the present favorable political military conditions to seize one or two important central cities so as to win an initial victory of the revolution in one or more provinces. The Red Army would conduct a series of offensives to expand their Soviets and to connect them starting in early 1932. They would target southern Jiangxi, such places as Guangzhou, Zhejiang, Nanchang, and also Fujian's Fuzhou, Xiamen, and Changzhou. The resolution also pushed for a, quote, positive and offensive line, rather than luring of the enemy into a deep strategy, as it was no longer viable. Furthermore, the resolution directly attacked Mao Zedong's strategy as being, quote, as being right opportunism that underestimated the situation and maintained a pessimistic attitude, and all party and army members should actively guard against its incorrect mindset. This effectively cemented the divide between the Bolshevik group's adoption of offensive strategy versus Mao Zedong's defensive lure the enemy in deep strategy. The next operation would be against Ganzhou in Jiangxi. The city linked the Hunan-Jiangxi border areas with the Fujian-Jiangxi border areas and provided a nice launching point against Jian in the north. During another meeting in 1932 at Rujin, Mao Zedong expressed his reservations about the operation, stating the Red Army did not have the necessary weapons or supplies to seize a major city. Zhu De backed him up, but the Central Military Committee vetoed them and continued planning the Ganzhou operation. On January the 10th, orders were handed out for the 1st, 3rd, and 5th Red Army Corps, along with the Jiangxi Soviet military regional forces, to conduct the operation by February. On the other side, the KMT were well prepared to meet an attack against Ganzhou. They were also most likely tipped off. On February the 3rd of 1932, the Red Army arrived at Ganzhou and they quickly encircled the city. The next day, the 5th Red Army Corps, roughly 20,000 men, were the first to attack the city. They struck the east gate, breaching the defenses slightly before being repelled. On the 17th and the 23rd, the Red Army forces conducted two major assaults, expanding the attacks to the west and south gates, but they failed to gain a foothold. During the siege, two NRA brigades reinforced the Ganzhou garrison. Then on March the 4th, the Red Army conducted a fourth major attack and it was likewise repelled. 3 days later, the Red Army retired to Jiangkou to reorganize after they had suffered 3,000 casualties. Despite this, the CCP leadership remained undeterred, believing the offensive strategy was still optimal. When Japan began rooting itself permanently in Manchuria, the CCP saw this as a perfect condition for a real revolution to take place. At a meeting on March 18th, Mao Zedong again argued his strategy fit the current conditions much more than that of the offensive strategy, which he argued was far too ambitious. Yet his arguments fell on deaf ears, and the CCP leadership had the Red Army reorganized into two route armies. The West Route Army consisted of the 3rd Army Corps and was responsible for expanding the Soviet areas west of the Gan River in the Hunan-Jiangxi border areas, with a focus built around Juichuan, Taihu, and Wan'an. The Central Route Army consisted of the 1st and 5th Red Army Corps and would take Mao Zedong's recommendations to perform expansion operations in South Fujian, with Xiamen being the final target. On March 26th, the Central Route Red Army occupied Changin under Mao Zedong's guidance. There they conducted political mobilization of the local populace. Yet, seeing little military action actually taking place, Zhou Enlai pushed Mao Zedong to stop the political mobilization and instead engaged the enemy in the direction of Changzhou. Thus, the Reds headed south and attacked the 49th NRA Division. On April the 10th, the Reds managed to seize Longyan, where they annihilated a single brigade of the 49th NRA Division. The 5th NRA Corps attempted to reinforce the 49th NRA Division, but they lost 2 brigades in the process. The Reds then continued marching south, and on April the 20th, they seized Changzhou, where they defeated the 49th NRA Division entirely. At Changzhou, they seized 1,675 prisoners, 2,000 rifles, some artillery pieces, 13,000 rounds of ammunition, 2 aircraft, and over $1,000,000 yuan. Alongside that came a lot of provisions, salt, and oil, other goodies needed to keep the men moving. After the success, Mao Zedong telegrammed Zhou Enlai requesting the Red Army move back into Jiangxi with their booty to improve operations in the Soviet area. It was Mao Zedong's belief the Reds had made great gains at Jiangzhou but could not hold on to the area. Instead, he wanted to expand operations in Fujian, using smaller local militia and guerrilla groups. The CCP yet again overruled Mao Zedong and on June the 5th ordered him to keep up the offensive, now turning towards Guangdong's military forces currently occupying southern Jiangxi. Once that was completed, they were to advance north up the Gan River Valley to attack Ganzhou, Jiangsu, Jian, and Nanchang so as to foster a revolution in Jiangxi. The Red Army then reorganized its forces, placing the 1st, 3rd, and 5th Red Army Corps under the 1st Front Red Army, who advanced into Guangdong Province. From late June into early July, the Reds seized Shuikao, Nanxiang, and defeated 15 Guangdong-based NRA brigades and expanded the Soviet into the province. Yet even with the string of offensive victories, Mao Zedong still remained vocally in opposition towards the strategy, constantly submitting his recommendation to adjust their footing. On July the 25th, Mao Zedong and Zhou De sent a joint communique to the CCP leadership requesting a change of strategy. They argued instead of immediately attacking Jian and Changshu, they should perform clearing operations on the eastern part of the valley, focusing on Yihuang and Luan. The CCP Central Committee was initially against the proposals. However, Zhou Enlai intervened and gave his full support to them. In August, the 1st Front Red Army held a conference and confirmed they would attack Yihuang and Luan. They took Lian shortly after, defeating the 27th NRA Division. With that victory, they gained 5,000 prisoners, 4,000 rifles, 20 machine guns, 20 artillery pieces, and 3 wireless communication sets. Pretty big bounty. Afterwards, the Red contemplated attacking Jian. However, after consideration, Mao Zedong argued on September the 25th the NRA presence at Jian was simply too strong. He instead recommended they conduct political mobilization operations around the Luan-Yuhang area. By this point, the CCP Central Committee was really pissed off with what they considered an insubordinate asshole named Mao Zedong. By this time, the 28 Bolsheviks had gained enough power and began stripping Mao Zedong of key positions within the Red Army. First, he was removed from the Military Committee of the Central Bureau of the Soviet areas. Have I mentioned how much communists love making endless committees and endless committee titles? Like really, there's a committee for everything. Like, my God. Later in October of 1933, an emergency conference was held at Ningdu to plan future operations on the eve of an impending KMT campaign. Participants included Zhou Enlai, Zhou De, Chen Yi, Liu Boqiang, and Peng Tuhua, who all agreed they should take up offensive actions outside the Soviet. Alongside this, the party condemned Mao Zedong's strategy, calling it inadequate and outdated. Zhou Enlai then argued for, quote, expanding Soviet territory swiftly, engaging the enemy on KMT territory, bringing Jiangxi and its neighboring Soviet areas together by force, taking key cities in the Gan Valley, including Nanchang, Jian, Ganzhou, and Pingxiang, so as to achieve preliminary successes in one or more provinces. After the Ningdu Conference, the Red Army continued with the offensive operation, now attacking Jianing, Liuchuan, and Tianning in October. By November, the 1st Front Army took the Jiangxi county seats of Zexi and Jinxi. This helped the CCP expand the Soviet in eastern Gan Valley, but it also placed them on a vulnerable footing, just in time for the KMT's 4th Major Encirclement Campaign. During the CCP's expansion activities, the KMT had been performing a communist suppression campaign in Shanghai, driving out the Bolsheviks and other CCP members towards the Jiangxi Soviet by late 1932. Their arrival in the Jiangxi Soviet added further tension to the Red Army, who were facing a new encirclement campaign. The presence of high-ranking Central Committee members also changed their politics. The Mao Zedong adapted Marxist-Leninist theory was replaced by more orthodox and Moscow-leaning theories. Many of the 28 Bolsheviks moved to many Soviet areas, sparking a new phase. Before the start of the 4th Major Encirclement Campaign, the Red Army from the Jiangxi Soviet conducted expansion operations into Fujian and Guangdong. Other Red Army units performed similar operations in Hunan, Hubei, and Sichuan. All of this Red activity was enough to push Chiang Kai-shek to refocus his military efforts against them. On April the 9th of 1932, Chiang Kai-shek created the Bandit Suppression Headquarters in Wuhan, with Hu Yingqin as its commander. Beginning in June of 1932, Hu Yingqin had a force of 500,000 soldiers who would unleash a brutal encirclement and suppression campaign against the Hubei, Henan Anhui, and western Hubei, Hunan Soviet areas. By November of 1932, both Soviets collapsed. After this, Chiang Kai-shek ordered Hu Ying-chin to direct his efforts against the Jiangxi Soviet. In December, Chiang Kai-shek shifted over 400,000 troops and 30 divisions to the Central Soviet operation. He even personally moved down to Nanchang to supervise the operation. The main forces consisted of 3 columns, roughly 150,000 troops in 12 divisions led by Chen Chong. The KMT plan was to build a series of blockhouses as a means of economically blockading the Soviet. Around 240,000 troops were allocated for the blockade, in addition to the main force, which brought the entire figure to 400,000 men. Each flank of the blockade had 70,000 troops, roughly 6 divisions, who would conduct blocking operations in the Jiangxi-Guangdong border area and the Fujian-Jiangxi border area. Around 100,000 would be used to conduct anti-guerrilla operations in the northwest and the northeast of Jiangxi as well, and in southeast Hunan and southwest Jiangxi. The blockade was set. Now the NRA would deploy the 3 columns along 3 separate routes converging upon the Red Army's rear for a concentrated attack. Over on the other side, the Red Army based near Luchuan had roughly 70,000 men from the 1st, 3rd, and 5th Red Army Corps and the 11th, 12th, 21st, and 22nd Red Armies. The Fourth Encirclement Campaign coincided with the Red Army's urban offensives. By December of 1932, the Reds had targeted Nanchang. The Central Committee issued the attack orders, but due to the large NRA reinforcement efforts, they had to order the Red Army to withdraw from the outskirts of Nanchang. The next potential target was Nanfang. The Central Committee again pushed for urban offensives as Nanfang was attacked beginning on February of 1933. On February the 7th, the Red Army besieged the city. The NRA quickly dispatched the Central Route Army to reinforce the city, and they conducted a counterattack. Seeing the large concentration of NRA in the area, on February the 17th, Zhou Enlai ordered the forces to pull out and head over to Luokou. The Red Army set up a diversion to cover their withdrawal. Using similar tactics employed during the Third Encirclement Campaign, the 11th Red Army pretended to be the main force and suddenly attacked Luchuan. The NRA took the bait immediately, sending 3 columns to Luchuan. While marching, the 1st NRA column's 52nd and 59th NRA divisions became separated. On February the 25th, the 2 divisions moved west towards Hongpi, along 2 routes separated by a mountain ridge. As they did so, their distance from the NRA's 2nd and 3rd columns increased, making mutual support impossible. On the 27th, the 1st and 3rd Red Army Corps and the 21st Red Army unleashed a surprise attack against the 52nd NRA Division. The next day, the 5th Red Army Corps and the 22nd Red Army attacked the 59th NRA Division around Hongpi. The division was annihilated, with its commander captured. After the victory, the Red Army pulled back to Luokou. After the loss, the NRA reorganized its force into 2 columns and changed strategy. Now, instead of heading in 3 wide columns, they would concentrate as 2 down the center of the Soviet. On March the 16th, the 2 NRA columns began their advance as the Reds redeployed their 11th Army to perform more deceptive operations. The 11th Red Army made a feint towards Guangchang, attracting the NRA front column. This action separated the 2 columns by about 50 kilometers and isolated the 11th NRA Division near Tategang. On March the 20th, the 1st Front Red Army attacked the 11th NRA Division near Shujiang, decimating them and severely defeating the 9th NRA Division. For the remainder of the Fourth Encirclement Campaign, there was no major battles. During March of 1933, the Reds conducted political operations near Le'an, until NRA forces moved there to secure the city. In April, the NRA began to withdraw from the Jiangxi Soviet area, effectively ending their encirclement campaign. The NRA had suffered considerable losses for their efforts. They had lost the equivalent of 3 divisions. Over 10,000 prisoners were taken. The Reds had seized 10,000 rifles, 300 German-made machine guns, and 40 artillery pieces. Another consequence of the failed encirclement campaign was the validation of the Bolshevik-led offensive strategy. The CCP then adopted a series of reform measures, hoping the Red Army could seize larger cities. First, the CCP attempted to expand the Red Army's overall strength by launching a large recruitment drive. In addition, they incorporated all the local militias in the main Red Army. To fund the expansion, the CCP adopted a large land distribution policy to generate revenue. Under the guise of performing a land investigation, the CCP distributed 80% of the land within the Soviet area. During the distribution, the CCP attempted to raise nearly 1 million yuan. During the summer of 1933, the CCP also focused on suppressing counter-revolutionaries. One of the 28 Bolsheviks' greatest critics was Liao Ming, the secretary of the Fujian Guangdong Jiangxi Soviet Committee. A large amount of recruitment and taxation had hurt the morale of the local people in the Soviet. When the Central Committee wanted troops there to deploy for action, Yao Ming argued they needed to stay for local defense, and that they should scale back offensive operations. However, from the perspective of the 28 Bolsheviks, it looked very similar to Mao Zedong's lure the enemy in deep strategy. At this point, they were still many loyal to Mao Zedong and his strategy, so the Bolsheviks saw an opportunity to hurt him through punishing Yao Ming. They created a new pejorative term, Liao Ming line, to describe any non-offensive strategy and began to purge many of the Fujian Guangdong Jiangxi Soviet's leadership. The Liao Ming line became a new slogan to describe any in the CCP who opposed the offensive strategy. During the summer of 1933, the Central Committee, emboldened by surviving the Fourth Encirclement Campaign, continued to press on with their offensive strategy. With the Bolsheviks and Otto Braun, the Jiangxi Soviet increased the central oversight over the Red Army and gradually seized direct control over military matters. On May the 8th, the CCP passed a resolution separating the Central Military Council and the Red Army leadership. Zhou De and Zhou Enlai remained in charge of the Red Army, but Bo Ge gained greater control over the Military Council, and he now controlled the Red Army's strategic and deployment of its military. Also, Otto Braun would play a much larger role in military strategy, leveraging his experience at the Front Academy to push for an offensive action. The Red Army also reorganized its units to facilitate the execution of the new offensive strategies. In June, the CCP divided the First Front Red Army into the Eastern Front Red Army and the Central Red Army. Bogue and Braun believed that the Red Army had grown strong enough, both in firepower and manpower, to no longer require coordinated, mutually supportive operations. Instead, they felt the Red Army units could carry out independent operations in different regions. The Eastern Front Red Army, composed of the 3rd Red Army Corps, was stationed in western Fujian, while the Central Red Army, formed from the 1st Red Army Corps, remained in the Central Soviet area. Under the guidance of the new Central Military Committee, the Eastern Front Red Army launched expansion efforts into Fujian after the NRA vacated the region. Peng Tuhuai's forces embarked on a 3-month campaign into Fujian, expanding Soviet-controlled territory, securing supplies, especially salt, and raising funds, addressing key shortages for both the Red Army and the CCP. Before the 5th extermination campaign, the Central Soviet controlled an impressive 60,000 square kilometers, spanning parts of 3 provinces. However, as they focused on territorial expansion, the Red Army neglected to monitor the KMT, which was preparing for another encirclement campaign. Now, we have primarily focused on one of the major Soviets implicated in the Fourth Encirclement Campaign. In reality, the Fourth Encirclement Campaign had been a larger-scale operation against 3 major Soviets: the Hunan Western Hubei Soviet, also referred to as the Honghu Soviet, the Hubei Henan Anhui or Enyuan Soviet, and the Jiangxi Soviet. You would be led to believe, and rightfully so, because many, let's just say, CCP-aligned sources like to highlight the Jiangxi Soviet story, that the communists had kind of duped the NRA and stolen their victory. It was much more of a mixed bag overall. The campaign against the Hunan Western Hubei Soviet saw the NRA successfully defeat the local Red Army forces, overrunning their main base in southern Hubei and Hunan. The majority of the fighting occurred around Jingzhou and overall was seen as a loss for the CCP. For the campaign against the Iyuan Soviet, drought, famine, and epidemics severely hurt the CCP forces in 1932. Between July and September, Chiang Kai-shek had allocated more than 300,000 troops for the operation. The CCP suffered tremendously because of the numerical superiority of the NRA. The NRA general, Xia Douyin, unleashed a scorched earth campaign, killing countless, burning many villages, and destroying any of the crops they could get their hands on. Historians like Chen Yaohuang argue the Fourth Red Army who participated in this area were defeated largely because they had adopted conventional warfare tactics. The peasantry were very hostile to the NRA, forcing their forces to depend on unreliable local elites for provisions, creating a very vulnerable supply line. However, the CCP failed to exploit this weakness by not committing to guerrilla warfare. Despite the NRA victory, it was rather incomplete, and they ended their campaign prematurely, celebrating. The Fourth Red Army had successfully retreated into the border region between Shaanxi and Sichuan, leaving behind a small force to conduct guerrilla warfare. The remaining communist forces in the Iyuan Soviet, led by Gao Jingting and Xu Heidong capitalized on the early nationalist withdrawal to rebuild a guerrilla movement. They hid in the mountains, survived by foraging, and organized poor peasants to seize grain from landlords and public granaries. The 25th Red Army, under their leadership, managed to maintain a communist presence in the region for several more years. After all was said and done, as was the case with the previous encirclement campaigns, reports from field commanders were far too optimistic. Many reported to Chiang Kai-shek exaggerated numbers of casualties inflicted, prisoners taken, and areas secured. In reality, what the communists were doing was simply moving around to give off the impression of their major defeats. Sure, the Reds were taking enormous losses, but they were constantly recruiting and spreading. They could probably sustain these yearly encirclement campaigns if the NRA did not do something much more bold, like actually encircle the Reds. As great as the Reds were becoming at outwitting their opponent, their luck would eventually run out. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all of that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, found over at YouTube and all major podcast platforms. Over on both, I'm just finishing up my North Africa campaign during World War II series. I also have a huge favor to ask. I recently opened up a YouTube membership. It's identical to my Patreon, found over at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. Joining either gets you access to the exclusive podcast, which is about 25 plus episodes and ongoing. You also get early access to all of the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. But if you decide to join the YouTube membership, there's a bit of a bonus. I have a bunch of unlisted episodes over the past few years that I haven't uploaded for politically incorrect reasons, we'll just say. A lot of cringe and more comedic stuff over there, in podcast form, mind you. So if you have a little extra and you want to help support me, please. The Reds had survived 4 large encirclement campaigns. The 28 Bolsheviks and their Moscow allies were greatly emboldened, thinking it was their time to go on the offensive and usher in a true revolution. However, those like Mao Zedong knew the dire reality of the situation, and they were bracing themselves for the coming storm.